after the initial crisis period in New York kind of ended in the late spring of 2020, and we sort of had a moment to breathe and think and reflect a bit on what had happened and what the experience had been, particularly for the children in shelter. We first started really thinking about the return to school in the fall of 2020 and what that was going to look like, really from a policy perspective. So the various government officials from city council, from the state, the public advocate, everybody was putting out different plans. And we started to digest some of those and try to understand, were there any special accommodations being made for kids living in shelter? Because one of the things that was really the germ of a lot of this was that when the city was having the discussion about whether to shut down schools in March of 2020, there was a lot of attention paid to the needs of children in shelter and in other difficult economic circumstances. The fact that so many services were received at school, from food to counseling to obviously learning supports, but just a lot of social supports on top of that. And would that be cutting children off from that by closing schools? So that was always in the forefront of mind. So then as we sort of rolled forward and into the fall, and it took a long time for schools to figure out for the city to figure out what it was going to do with schools. And ultimately the hybrid situation came about where children had the option of either attending school in person half of the week and attending remotely the other half, or opting to learn remotely completely. So then that turned into looking more at the data and where that was all heading, and who was deciding, who was choosing to do what kind of learning and perhaps why. And we then, this project was a long evolution in a lot of different forms that ultimately came into this article. And then the last piece, and I think what gives part and what really makes it an article for Beyond Housing and gives it, any heart, is the narrative piece of what was really happening inside the shelters. And while we didn't speak to kids directly, we spoke to the staff who work in direct relationship with those children and with their parents, and really trying to reflect on what had occurred and what their hopes were, because now, as we were working on this piece, we were moving into this new school year, which would be the third interrupted year. And I think at the time we thought it would be less interrupted than it has become. And really focusing on what would the return look like, and what were parents hopeful about, and what were they still anxious about.